So welcome. I'm Mark Besonen, and I'm the director of the Student Workshop for International Coastal and Marine Management, also known as the SWIM program. And we're based at the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. And this is one of a series of short interviews we're conducting with reef managers from around the Gulf of Mexico, part of the SWIM 2021 program, to give the student participants a perspective, in particular tri-national perspective, about reef management around the Gulf of Mexico and how it's, the similarities and differences between the different nations. And so today we're focused on the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary in the US, and we have the great pleasure to be speaking with Park Superintendent Schmahl. And I thank you so much for your time today coming to speak with us. And so I'm going to jump right in and start off with a bunch of questions, and so we can get this going. Welcome.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mark. And I'm happy to be here.
Great. So could you please tell us about yourself, the basics, your name, your role in the park administration, your background, education experience. How many years have you been working in the park? So just a general picture about your background.
Sure. My name is George Schmahl, and I go by my first initials, GP. So you'll hear both George or GP is fine. And I am the superintendent of the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. I've been here now for since 1999. So it's been 22 years. I've been here quite a while. We are based out of Galveston, Texas. And we administer the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, which we'll be talking about quite a bit. My background is that I started out as an interest in marine biology, and I got both my undergraduate and master's degree in biological sciences and zoology. And for my master's, I did study coral reefs in the Florida Keys with a specialty on coral reef sponges. I still have a strong interest in that. Also had some experience in my early career with some regulatory issues, working for on kind of permitting kind of stuff in my early days, and also with some coastal management jobs with the state of Florida before I originally got a job with the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and worked there for a number of years before I moved to the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary.
Wow, great. Impressive background. Can you tell us a little bit about when the Flower Garden Banks Park or National Marine Sanctuary was established, and what is sort of the general legal framework under which it was established?
Yeah, sure. The first, I guess I should mention that the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary is part of a national system of national marine sanctuaries. We compare ourselves to the National Park Service sometimes because more people are familiar with the National Park Service than they are with the National Marine Sanctuary Program. But we are a system of essentially marine parks located throughout the waters of the U.S. and some U.S. territories, from the Florida Keys to the waters of Stellwagen Bank off of Massachusetts, to several sanctuaries in the off of California and the West Coast, including in sanctuaries in Hawaii and even one in American Samoa. We even have national marine sanctuaries in the Great Lakes. But we are the only national marine sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico. The Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary was designated in 1992, and we are administered by a federal agency. The federal agency is NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is actually housed in the Department of Commerce, which is kind of interesting. It's a little bit different than the National Park Service, which is in the Department of Interior. But in some ways similar to the Park Service in terms of what we do and how we manage things. The administrative framework is that there is a federal act called the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. It was originally created in 1972, and it allows the Secretary of Commerce to designate areas that are marine areas and marine and Great Lake areas that are of national significance. And that means they contain some kind of resource that is of national significance, and that can range in terms of the type of resource, from historical resources such as shipwrecks and other historical and cultural resources, to a variety of marine resources. In our case, it's coral reefs is the reason why the Flower Garden Banks was designated, but it could be because of kelp forests or the existence of marine mammals such as whales and that kind of thing. So the resources, the reason why these sanctuaries are designated can vary quite substantially depending on the area that the sanctuary exists.
Oh, great. Can you tell us a little bit then about the infrastructure and sources of funding that support the sanctuary and that you guys rely on for your activities? Where how do you make it work, basically?
Well, being a federal agency, most of our funding comes directly from congressional, U.S. congressional appropriations. So every year, we are allocated a sum of money to operate the marine sanctuary system, and that those funds are divided up, among the. I forgot to mention that there are 14 national marine sanctuaries, throughout the system of the National Marine Sanctuary Program. And so that money that is designated by Congress is divided up among the various sanctuaries. The program in total is about $50 to $55 million in terms of federal appropriations. While that's a fair amount of money in the bigger picture, it's not a lot of money when you divide it up among the sanctuaries and the broad range of responsibilities and resources that we are meant to manage. So we do, and so that's our base funding, and that's what we utilize mainly to fund our programs. But we are always looking for other sources of funding, and we do that, through developing partnerships with a variety of agencies, both other governmental entities as well as non-governmental organizations. We have some support groups. So, we actually have a National Marine Sanctuary Foundation that has been set up to solicit funds from interested people that, to help support various programs and projects in the sanctuary. So, so while our main source of funding comes directly from the federal government, we also rely on outside sources of funding wherever we can find them, and also utilizing to whatever extent we can the use of volunteers and support from interested citizens who want to do something to help the sanctuaries and help protect the marine environment.
Yeah, so thank you for that. It sounds taking advantage of everything that you can, which makes sense.
I guess I'll go ahead and mention then our specific budget, for this sanctuary is just slightly over $1 million from our congressional appropriation. So I can give you some perspective. I don't know how that compares to other parks in that you're looking at, but just for comparison.
Oh, okay, yeah, thank you for offering that. Definitely makes a difference, because when you look at the number of staff you have and everything you do, it's going to make a difference. Can you give us a brief overview of the park? For example, how big is it? Where is it located? And what are the main types of corals and habitat that are found in the sanctuary?
Sure. I think maybe to help this, I'm gonna share my screen and show you just a couple of photographs, a map, and a few photographs, so give you maybe a little bit better idea of what we are about. This first map is a map of the entire National Marine Sanctuary system that I mentioned, and those you can see around the country, a number of blue dots, and those blue dots correspond to the various sanctuaries that occur within the National Marine Sanctuary system. The up until very recently, and recently in the last couple of months. This is where the sanctuary is. It included 3 offshore features that we call banks. That's where the name Flower Garden Banks come from, and those are underwater features. They do not rise to the surface, so they're not islands. They're just completely submerged features, and they're located about from 80 to 100 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. And those 3 original banks, were the East Flower Garden Bank, the West Flower Garden Bank, and Stetson Bank. This area was designated primarily because of a coral reef that exists on the tops of these of the East and West Flower Garden Bank primarily, and it's a very well-developed coral reef. This is just a photo of a couple of shots of what the reef looks like. It's notable in that it is still in quite good health, even though I'm sure everyone is aware that coral reefs in general are in various states of decline, most places in the world, including most places in the Caribbean. But for a variety of reasons, the reefs of the Flower Garden Banks have not yet been significantly affected by negative impacts and are still in relatively good health. We have over the averaged living coral cover at the East and West Flower Garden Banks is over 50%, and 50% living coral cover is very high in comparison with most coral reefs, actually anywhere in the world, and especially in the Caribbean. However, after a long process that we have been going through for a number of years, actually almost 10 years or so, we have recently expanded the sanctuary, and we now contain 17 offshore reefs and banks in the general vicinity. This map that should be on the screen now, the areas outlined in red are the areas that I just mentioned, the East and West Flower Garden Bank and Stetson Bank, which was the original sanctuary designated in 1992, but now includes 14 additional banks, or portions of 14 additional banks that run primarily to the east of the Flower Garden Banks, over a range of about 140 miles that include a number of other features. And so most of these features, like I mentioned, these are all underwater mountains, I guess you'd call them. They rise from the surrounding seafloor. The depths are around 200 meters or so is the deepest parts of the sanctuary, and these features rise up within 20 to 30 meters of the surface in some cases. So they incorporate a number of a variety of habitats. The coral reef portion is confined to the very shallowest portions of the tops of these features, but many of the other reefs and banks are in deeper water, deeper than 50 meters, where there's not as much light. And these are communities that are known as mesophotic areas. That means mid-level light, so it doesn't have as much light that can support true coral reef development. But you have, as this photograph shows, a lot of other types of deeper water coral communities that exist down there. These are primarily known as soft corals or octocorals or gorgonians, black corals, lots of species of sponges, other types of benthic organisms attached to the substrate. And these also provide very important habitat for a variety of fish and invertebrate species. And many of those fish species are of commercial and recreational importance. So so that's kind of the range of the area. The original sanctuary was about 56 square miles in size. And now with the expansion, the area that's covered under the sanctuary is about 164 square miles. So it's kind of we've kind of tripled in size in just recently. And when I say recently, this expansion just went into effect in March of this year, so just a couple of months ago. So we're quite excited about that. It is a large area of increase though, and so it offers a lot more challenges related to management and oversight.
Yeah, just curiously, did your budget triple as well to reflect the triplet?
Well, that's
expansion.
no is the short answer. Of course, we're heading in as we head into the next budget cycle. We are propose. We obviously the needs that we have related to the expansion. We are letting our folks know so that we hopefully will have some increases in budget as time goes on. But
sure. Well, no, that's it's great, but it's also, I can see it's going to be a challenge as well. So it's fantastic that we can add to the sanctuary. Superintendent Schmahl, can you tell us a little bit about the connectivity of the park with respect to the continental coast and other large urban centers? And is it relatively easy to reach the park? So we got an idea with the map there, but I mean, do you get a lot of visitors in that sense, just coming out to visit the sanctuary?
No is the again is the short answer. Like I mentioned, these areas range from the closest one is about 80 miles offshore. The farthest one is about 120 miles offshore. So obviously that's a long way to go. And so for someone in a personal boat, they would have to have quite a substantial boat to get out, and do activities out there. Our primary interest, I guess, of the direct kind of use that happens is related to both recreational and commercial fishing and recreational diving. And for fishermen, there are people who can get out that far in their fishing boats, both recreationally and commercially. And then, of course, there is interest from the recreational diving community. These are spectacular reefs to visit. The areas that can be, dived on, within recreational typical recreational diving depths. But most people who are diving out there go on a charter boat. There's a couple that operate charter trips out to the Flower Garden banks and take divers to out for typically multi-day trips, from 2 to 4 days. We estimate that we get about 2,500 divers a year going through that method out to the reef. And so again, in comparison, that's not a lot. For example, in the Florida Keys, when I was there, I worked at Lou Key area, and they get about 70 to 80,000 divers, a year. So it's a different scale. So that's the kind of use we get. I should also mention that our regulations do allow fishing in the sanctuary, but by hook and line only. So what our regulations restrict the types of gear that's able to be used for fishing. So anything other than hook and line fishing is not allowed in the sanctuary.
Okay, and so presumably then, I mean, that's part of the reason you mentioned earlier how well conserved or well preserved these reefs are. It's simply that they're a little bit further offshore, they're just not so accessible, and so that's really a benefit in that sense, the location.
Yes, and you asked about sort of the connectivity with the land, and so of course that is a big concern about coral reefs in general. Is runoff from the adjacent land areas, and typically coral reefs are close to shore, and so that's a big factor. Luckily, and one of the reasons why the reefs at the Flower Garden banks are in relatively good health is that we are in general outside of that area that is directly subject to runoff from the coast. Now, I say generally because there are situations where there have been extreme events of runoff. For example, related to hurricanes, or Hurricane Harvey was a good example where there was so much rain that came into the coastal areas of Texas, and that runoff, you could see it on satellite, was did make it out, to the Flower Garden Banks area. And people are also aware of the dead zone that kind of develops off the coastal Louisiana most years. And again, in general, that area is mostly confined to the nearshore areas off Louisiana and doesn't get as far off as the Flower Garden Banks. So it's so again, we are kind of buffered from those kinds of impacts because of the offshore nature of the location.
Okay, wonderful. My next question for you, and we a little bit answered it already, but is what are the main historic and present day economic activities and industries in the park or nearby? And I think you mentioned, recreational fisheries and commercial fisheries, and also diving obviously is one of the big ones. Are those pretty much, is that pretty much the list of things that are happening in that area? Or
for the most part, yes. From the historically, it's interesting, the Flower Garden Banks were not even, really known about until the early 1900s. And it was discovered by fishermen, probably fishing for red snapper as the fishery developed for red snapper in that part of the time frame. But again, it was difficult to get to. It was a long trip. It wasn't heavily utilized, but it was, sort of discovered by fishermen in that time frame, and originally given its name by fishermen because of the colorful things they could see, because the water is really clear out there. As you go offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, as near shore, is a lot of times it's pretty muddy and kind of not very good visibility. But as you get offshore, the water out of 100 miles offshore is Caribbean blue. It's very good visibility. And so it really wasn't utilized that heavily. But then, as time went on and vessels got more capable, of traveling offshore, the navigation systems became more sophisticated and could find these areas a lot better. There's more and more interest, by fishermen. And then, of course, in the 1970s or so, when scuba diving started to become very popular, and this area was discovered as a very good diving spot. Not only does it have excellent coral reef formations that people can see, but it is frequently visited by some larger marine animals like manta rays, sea turtles, primarily loggerhead sea turtles, and whale sharks, schools of hammerhead sharks. And so it's an area that people have the opportunity to have large marine animal encounters as well. And so it became popular as a diving destination in the 70s and onward. In the meantime, around, during all that period, it was also this area was being explored for offshore oil and gas development and resources. And so while they were not, targeting the Flower Garden Banks specifically, the geological formations that make these underwater features are actually salt domes, geological formation of, ancient deposits of salt that have kind of bulged up beneath the seafloor and pushed these features up to make them. And it turns out that these salt domes are also areas that are kind of trap oil and gas. And so they are targeted, for exploration as well. And so there was a large interest in by the offshore oil and gas industry to drill in areas that were quite close to to some of these features. And that was the original concern, that there might be impacts related to the offshore oil and gas industry, and that heightened the research that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s, and some of the original protections that were established for these areas so that they would be protected from activities related to offshore oil and gas. So while the direct, direct activities that are out there, as you mentioned, essentially recreational fishing, recreational diving. There's oil and gas development in the area. And interestingly, it also became, because of the nature of these areas, it became a very focused area for scientific research. And so we actually consider researchers, one of our, constituent groups, because the history of research at the Flower Garden Banks has been quite substantial. Now we have one of the longest running coral reef monitoring programs anywhere. And it serves kind of as a model because it is still in good health right now. A lot of people are interested in why this area is still somewhat resilient in comparison with other coral reefs and that kind of thing. So it's
Great.
been a strong area for research as well.
All right, fantastic. My next question for you here. Could you tell us who are the main stakeholders and users of the reef? We've talked about that a little bit here. And then here's the kicker, the important part. Can you try to distinguish between the stakeholders who have an actual influence on the park versus those stakeholders that are basically just using it, but they don't have too much influence themselves? Or maybe they're the same group. Maybe if they're users, they're also influencers. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, the primary direct users are fishers and divers, and obviously there is an potential impact related to both of those activities. Fishing probably more than diving. There is some of our studies have shown a general decrease in some of these fish species, larger fish species that historically occurred in the area. The size of grouper and snapper have been reduced over the years. The numbers of sharks and other amberjack and other large pelagic species seem to be not as common as they were. And I think that's probably it could be a number of factors, but fishing is part of that. We don't believe that divers have an extreme amount of impact, but I think people who dive do understand that some divers are either careless or can or sometimes actually take things from, even though we have regulations that basically say you can't take anything from the sanctuary. Some people just can't help see a beautiful shell of some sort, sticking it in their BC pocket. But we don't think that has been a major impact over the years. So we don't think that and also, I mentioned the oil and gas industry. I think because of the recognition early on that there could be impacts from the industry and protective measures that were put in place by the Minerals Management Service, which is now the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, have acted to protect these areas from those types of impacts. And there are occasional impacts that have happened from direct. We have had over the years some impacts from anchoring by vessels. Also, in the early days of seismic exploration for oil and gas, there's on the East Flower Garden Bank, there's an old seismic cable that must have gotten caught up on the reef at one point, and now it's kind of interesting because it's been overgrown by coral to the point that it would be probably more damage to try to remove it than to leave it there. So we have those kinds of things, but so one thing that was related to the expansion is related to fishing, and there is a good bit of bottom longline fishing that occurs in this area, and that can cause some impacts to the bottom communities, and we had observed some of that impact, and we've also observed a good amount of marine debris related to old, fishing line and that kind of thing. So, we don't think that direct kind of activity has had a significant impact on the resources at least so far.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. My next question was about main stakeholder activities, but I think we've kind of talked about that already. So I'm gonna pass on that one. But here's sort of a practical question. And especially now knowing that you just tripled your area, and not just the area, but also the extent has grown massively. How many people do you have on your park staff to deal with this, to help manage this?
We have a relatively small staff. We have about 12 people who are basically year-round employees, direct employees of the sanctuary. We do have our own research vessel. It's quite a good vessel. It's an 83-foot boat that can hold 14 people for multi-day cruises, and we do have 3 or 4 additional people that work as crew on the vessel during our research season, which is typically May through October.
Okay, so it sounds great, but then when you look at the aerial extent and think about just the logistics of being able to get out there and stuff, it's a great challenge, I can imagine. I was going to ask you also, so you mentioned this park was established under the National Marine Sanctuaries rule or law, and so is that where it derives most of its legal protection from? Is it basically that set of rules, or?
Yes, when a sanctuary is designated, there is there are regulations that are promulgated to protect the resources that the sanctuary was intended to protect. So those regulations vary from sanctuary to sanctuary. Our regulations, I mentioned a couple of them already. One is that any kind of disturbance of the seafloor is prohibited, and anchoring is specifically prohibited by any vessel. We do provide mooring buoys at the shallow parts of the coral reef area to allow people to access the reef by tying up to a mooring buoy and not having to anchor. So it's also that taking essentially anything except fish that you catch by conventional hook and line gear. So spearfishing is prohibited at the sanctuary as well. And so those regulations are promulgated as part of the designation process, and they are in the Code of Federal Regulations, and they as any other federal regulation would be. Discharge is prohibited, except as it relates to, routine vessel operations and that kind of thing. So it's fairly protected in general. Like I say, fishing, certain types of fishing is allowed.
Okay, great. So given that, here's a question. I mean, do you think that the rules and regulations are generally respected? Because you can't obviously be at the whole area all the time, and if they're not respected, what might this be due to? Could it be due to lack of enforcement? And if so, why is that the case? Is it simply due to lack of resources? Is it due to the location? Something else? We're just trying to get a feeling for, if in general the people that do visit the reef are pretty respectful of it, and implicitly they must be, because if you're in pretty good shape.
We do believe that we have very good compliance with the regulations in general by people. People, I think, really respect the area, recognize the sensitivity of it and the importance of it, and we do feel that we have high compliance with the regulations now. That being said, it is a very difficult place to keep an eye on. As we mentioned, 100 miles offshore is very difficult, even though we have our own vessel and we get out there quite frequently, at least during the the summertime period. We're not out there all the time. There's no way that we can kind of provide oversight at all times. So we rely very much on partners. The U.S. Coast Guard, is out in the area frequently for doing a variety of tasks, including regulatory stuff, both for fishing regulations and for sanctuaries. And we have a good relationship with them, and they do provide some level of presence and enforcement at the sanctuary. Again, it's not a lot. They also fly over the area. In fact, the group out of Corpus Christi flies throughout the Gulf, looking for stuff, and they report, vessel activity and other things that they see in the vicinity of the sanctuary. One of the biggest partners we have in that actually is the recreational dive charter boat that runs out there. During the season, it's out there a lot more than we are, and of course it's kind of to their benefit to make sure that the area stays in good health, because their customers kind of are going out there to do that, and they will report to us if they see anything that looks suspicious or anything unusual. But my experience, and I've been here quite a while now, the incidents of, and you do have people that go out there and purposefully go out there and spearfish or take things, and and I think that happens, it's just kind of human nature, I guess, sometimes. But the instance of that has been relatively low. It's more in the case, I think, that people don't know the regulations. And that's always a challenge, to make sure people are aware of the area and aware of the regulations that apply to it. And that's going to be a challenge for us for the expansion area, because we have a lot more area now to make sure that people know about.
Yeah, fair enough. And also, I mean, now you're expanding all over, all the way over to Louisiana as well. So, I mean, I don't know if there's different regulations between Texas and Louisiana, but maybe it's also even just that could be a factor in it. So let me ask you another one here. What is the hardest challenge for you and your staff with actually managing this park? And I'm coming up with a feeling what it might be, since given this last few minutes, but could you let us know if maybe there's something else, your hardest challenge?
Yeah, I think we've kind of touched on that, because of the nature of the area. One of our challenges related just to because part of our job, is to let people know about this area, and so educating and informing people about this resource is difficult when people, it's very difficult for people to get out there and see it themselves, so and most people probably will never have the opportunity to do that, but at the same time, it's really important that people understand that it's out there and how important it is, both just for the environment and also for the economy of the Gulf of Mexico, because like I say, these are the habitats that support the fishery that or a large part of the fishery that occurs in this part of the Gulf. So we have challenges, informing people, about it. Even folks that live right here in Galveston, where we are located, if you just, kind of polled people that you meet on the street, there's a large percent of them don't even know that the flower garden banks exist, and so that's always a challenge. And then, of course, just what we were talking about before in terms of enforcement, in terms of monitoring, research and monitoring, it's just logistically very difficult. It's expensive to get out there and conduct any kind of activity. So those are the main challenges. And of course, it a lot of times comes back to funding, and so it's always a challenge to try to get the resources, the monetary resources necessary to manage this area.
What about specific threats? Can you think of any threats that you would, that you guys are aware of to the sanctuary in particular? I mean, they could be anthropogenic threats, or they could be natural threats, or climate change or whatever. Do you have any feelings about that, or thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I first got here 20 some years ago, I kind of thought that the sort of the direct anthropogenic impacts, of use and that kind of thing was probably the biggest challenge, but come to realize that that's not. We've touched a little bit on just water quality, and runoff that would make it all the way out to the flower garden banks. We've seen that in the cases of some of the runoff events that I mentioned previously with Hurricane Harvey and some other, and we had an odd die off of a portion of the coral reef in 2016 that we think was related to a very heavy runoff year. So, water quality in general, is of concern, and then the overriding thing that I think everyone is aware of now is climate change. We have documented with our, we have instrumentation out at the reef that we've had out there for decades now, and we have shown that there has been a significant trend of increasing seawater temperatures over that period. As you know, coral bleaching is directly related to increased seawater temperatures. We have had coral bleaching events over the years, and they seem to be becoming more frequent and maybe more severe. We had a very substantial bleaching event again in 2016 that we are very concerned about, although the corals did recover from that event, and in the previous coral bleaching events, they have substantially recovered. Again, I think it's because of the offshore nature of it. We don't get it's not as the duration of those increased seawater prolonged as they are in some nearer shore reefs. But we are very concerned that, if this trend continues, and that we will start seeing mortality related to coral bleaching, which is directly related to climate change. And the of course, issue related to climate change is we do have a project. Actually, some folks from Hart Research Institute are working with us to monitor pH acidification at the reef, and that, of course, can have, in the longer term, can have devastating effects to coral areas as well. So that's the biggest concern. It's a hard one to address. Obviously, we can't address that on a local level. No regulation that we can promulgate is going to address that. So it's a much bigger picture, in terms of our society, and how we have to come to grips with that, I think, or else some of these areas we're going to lose some of these coral areas for sure.
Yeah, for sure. No, definitely a big picture problem to work on. Just got two more questions for you. So, what kind of connectivity, biological, oceanographic, genetic, do you think that the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary has with other coral systems, either within the Gulf of Mexico or going out into the greater Caribbean? Because that's one of the things that we're thinking about. In the swim program here, because you guys are the Flower Garden Banks is significantly over inside the Gulf, but it's connected, right?
It's absolutely connected. It's very interesting, and you probably know this as well as anybody, that the ocean currents and circulation patterns in the Gulf of Mexico are actually quite complex. But in general, as you know, the Gulf Stream waters come up and loop into the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico, bringing warm, clear Caribbean water into the Gulf, and then loop back out, and up the east coast of the U.S. And there's a series of circulatory patterns that kind of track west from the loop current that bring that water over to the western part of the Gulf of Mexico. And so there have been studies done on, like, the Florida Keys. The reefs of the Florida Keys are about 700 miles away. That's quite a long way. So the Yucatan, are also pretty isolated, but there is genetic connectivity there. It happens, maybe not continuously, but on certain types of episodic events, to bring coral larvae from those areas to the Gulf of Mexico and vice versa. Like I mentioned, the coral at the Flower Garden Banks are quite healthy. Coral spawning, occurs, every year, and the output from that coral spawning event at the Flower Garden Banks is quite substantial. hopefully that output is going, somewhere and helping to seed other reefs in the Caribbean. There's been a good bit of work, in looking at genetics of various organisms, corals in particular, to show that there is absolute connection between the corals in the flower garden banks, Florida Keys, and the areas of Mexico, Alacrán, reef, for example. So even though they're quite isolated, they are connected. I think, did I lose you for a second? I think
yeah, I think we
froze for a minute. I don't know
that's okay.
if I did as well.
That's okay. No problem. So anyway, thank you for that. Got one more question for you, and we'll let you go after that. Do you guys at the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary have any relationships or agreements with other reef systems and parks, especially on the international front? And I kind of know the answer to that, but I wanted to hear from you.
Yes, I think we have very strong interest with developing those kinds of agreements, especially internationally, and we've done some work in that regard. Back in 2015, we did establish a sister sanctuary program, both with ourselves and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, with some areas in Cuba. Might get the pronunciation of this round, Guanacabibes Marine Park and the Banco de San Antonio National Park were both areas that have very strong resemblances in some ways to the Florida Keys and the Banco de San Antonio, especially to the Flower Garden Banks. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go down to Cuba, to Havana, with the signing of that formal agreement. It was quite an accomplishment. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to take advantage of some of those connections because of the politics, I guess. But we are very interested in trying to reestablish some of those connections. In the same way with Mexico, we would be very interested in doing some more work with the marine parks around Mexico. They have a very, very well established marine protected area system in Mexico, which is a good model for the world. So yes, we have very strong interest. We've made some inroads there, and we're looking forward to some to increasing those relationships in the future.
Wow, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for taking so much time to speak with us today and giving us this great overview about Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And it's just going to be really helpful for us as we put together sort of our perspective about this trinational perspective. Even though we're focused on Alacranes for this particular program, this gives us the big picture.
Great. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for this program. I know that this is really important to get people together, and students especially. That's the future, and that's what we need is those people to be well informed about what's been going on in the bigger picture.
Okay, thank you.